My name is Roger Berkowitz, and as you know, I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I welcome you to our virtual reading group. We are today going to finish up volume one of The Life of the Mind on Thinking. In many ways, we finished it last week insofar as we read the last two sections of the actual thinking chapter or first book of this book. Today we're reading what's called the Postscriptum, which is really a look forward to the next two books that Hannah Arendt was going to write on willing and judging. She never finished them. She never finished any of these three books, but certainly never finished those. The willing section is drafted, and the judging section was never written. And so this postscriptum has become somewhat of one of those famous prophetic texts in which people scour very few words to try and say what would have been in this section, especially the judging section. And, the idea that Hannah Arendt was in some sense going to solve her life's work by writing a section on judging, which was going to give the answers to all of the dilemmas that her work explored over the previous 40 years, is one of those ideas, hopes that I think especially many young Arendt scholars hold. I get emails from people all the time saying, I figured out Arendt on Judgment, and as a result, I know everything that she was going to say. So we're going to read this postscriptum today. It's only 4 pages. It's not a lot, and yet there's a lot in it that we can try and say something about. And then we'll talk a little bit about going forward and our next book today. So I will start and try and put this postscriptum in context. I hope that leads to questions and really a conversation. So, as I said, the postscriptum comes at the end of the section on thinking and is a bridge to the following sections that we're told will be on willing and judging. Looked at from the perspective of time speculations, she says, they concern matters that are absent, either because they are not yet or because they are no more. And this is in contradiction to thinking, which deals with the invisibles in all experience and always tends to generalize, whereas thinking, willing, and judging deal with particulars. So let me just break this up into some, I hope, manageable bites. On the one hand, we can separate willing and judging from thinking, because willing and judging concern, temporally speaking, what is not yet, namely willing, what will come, what I want to be, and judging, which concerns what is no more, namely what already has happened, in which I make a judgment about it. Thinking, as we know, is very different from judging and willing along these time speculations. We talked about this last week, but let me just quickly review. In the parable that Kafka tells about the eternal past and the eternal eternal future pushing in on the past, thinking is that activity, that faculty and activity in which we, on the one hand, in the dream of metaphysics, we jump out of this battleground between the past and the future, and we become a disinterested spectator who can find meaning and judge the performance of the past and the future. That's sort of Arendt's reading of Kafka's parable. And she says in the last chapter that we can actually go further without doing violence to the parable, and say that it's actually the fact that man gives meaning to the world by deflecting the stream of the past and the future. That thinking is precisely this act of deflection. That to me is, if you could, the first time I think I sort of understood that or made sense of that, it was a huge revelation to me. What does that mean to say that thinking is an act of deflection and fighting? It means that in thinking, you take the past, you take the possible futures, and you wrestle them, you fight them, and you come up with an account of the world as it is. And in so doing, you act freely. And she says, thinking is thus the place of freedom. It's the place in which we are in this gap, in this temporal gap between past and future, and we remove ourselves from both past and future, and we find a meaning. We make a meaning, and that's why it's an activity of freedom. It's not true. Remember, the whole premise of thinking is that it doesn't seek truth, it seeks meaning. And if we understand that this idea of thinking is this battle, this deflection that takes the past and the future and, in a sense, wrestles them into a present that is meaningful, every person and every generation, Arendt writes, paves anew the path of thought. Every person in the now and every generation in the now steps out of time, steps out of the battle of the past and the future into a non-time, she calls it, a non-time of the present that is out of order and original and new. And then she starts talking about great works, great artworks, great books, great acts, great political acts. And what she says is that great works see the past, people who create the great works, so the great artists, politicians, actors, individuals, generations, peoples, those who create great works, she says, see the past as their past, as their predecessors. I see the past as mine. It comes to me. I see the past as leading up to me, thus relative to me. We talked a lot about the relativity of this thinking act for her. And I also see the future as my successors or our successors. And thus I see the present as my time. And in that present, I create works, artworks, acts, political works, depends on what kind of creator I am, that stamp a kind of temporal nowness, my temporal nowness, my idea, onto this now, and I put them into the world, and people can, as we've talked about, ignore them. At which point, my thought, the manifestations or reifications of my thought are forgotten, or they can destroy them or put me in jail because my thought is considered to be dangerous and rebellious, or they can be struck by my thought, the things I reify, the artworks I make, the actions I do, and people can start talking about them. And in talking about them, they can start to immortalize them. And my things, and maybe me as a thinker or actor, become part of the immortal world that lasts. Um, in this fight, this wrestling, this battle of thought, she says thought is like an island of pure reason, separated from the everyday world by a wide and stormy sea. It's not the island of truth. As we said, it's the island of meaning, where I make my meaning in the world. So that's one way that willing and judging differ from thinking. Thinking is about the now, creating the now, being in the now, fighting in the now. Willing and judging are about past and the future. A second way, she says, that willing and judging differ from thinking is that thinking deals with generalities, right? Invisibles. It desenses. We've talked about this a lot. It doesn't deal with particulars. It takes everything away from the world. It annihilates the real. It destroys all criteria for judgment and measurement. Whereas willing and judging deal with particulars. And thus they're much closer to the world of appearances, not the world of invisibles and thought. So that's sort of the first. She says, okay, there's this distinction. We've been talking about thinking. Now we're going to move to willing and judging. And A, we're no longer going to be dealing with the present. We're going to be dealing with the past and the future. And B, we're going to move into this world of particulars as opposed to generalities. She says, one might seek to use this insight to justify thinking, to make thinking something that we should do. In the sense that thinking becomes an indispensable preparation for willing into the future, right? If you want to know what you will, you should know what you think, what's true, what's rational. And if you want to judge the past, you should know what's right. And she says, no, actually, this is not how you justify thinking. Thinking is no use. Right? We've talked about the one time thinking has use for her is in times of emergency, moral or other emergency, where the thinker's very uselessness, their standing apart, separates them and shows the need to stop and think and question what is happening. She says, willing cannot be prepared for by thinking because willing is radically free. If you believe that we prepare our will by first thinking about what is true or what is right or what is rational, then you seek to limit will. In a sense, you limit will by rationality. And that, she says, is to deny the very radical power of will, which is to be spontaneous and free. And so she says that Henri Bergson says that a will is a coup d'etat. It's absolutely free. It can't be controlled by something like thinking or reasoning. He then goes through a short history of what the long chapter on willing is going to be. He starts with St. Paul, who famously says, and what she says is that willing has a history, and it emerges at a historical time. The Greeks didn't know willing. The first real thinker of the will is St. Paul, who says, I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. This is from the letter to the Romans. The idea here is that what I want to do is follow the law, do the good, according to Paul. But I don't do the good most of the time. I usually do the bad. which I hate insofar as I'm a good person. And in every will, for Paul, and then more so for Augustine, if ever I say I should will to do the good, I should will to tell the truth. Why? Because it's the law, because it's the right thing to do. Immediately, Augustine says, what pops into my head is I should lie. Because, well, I don't really want to follow the law. I also want to do what the opposite. The very idea that I'm constrained to tell the truth raises a counter will, what Augustine calls a nil, a nilling to say I should lie. So that in every will, there is a I will and there is a I nil. There's a battle. And so the will itself is this battle. And it's only resolved in Augustine through the idea of love, namely that in acting into the world, I resolve my battle between I want to lie and I want to tell the truth, and whichever one I do, I love my act, and in doing so, I resolve the conflict that was in my will. So for Arendt, this choice, this will, is one of absolute freedom. It has no rational. You don't resolve which I should do, lie or tell the truth by reason or by thinking. You resolve it by some act of love, which cannot be explained or predicted in advance. The great change in our history of willing comes with thinkers like Hegel and the German idealists, who begin to think that there is actually a standard for judging what you should will, namely success, namely history. And so in the final instance, Schelling says, there is no other being than will. All we have is will. It's this act, but we can, in the sense, decide on whether the will was good or not based on whether it accords with progress, with the progress of history. And this idea of willing and progress becomes the driving force of modern thought. The last part of the book and the postscript, the one she never wrote, the one that has caused the most hand-wringing by Arendt scholars, is on judgment. And she says, I will conclude the second volume with an analysis of the faculty of judgment. And she says there's a scarcity of sources, and that really no one ever talked about judgment until Kant. We'll leave that aside. But for now, the main point and the interest in judgment here is that it is not logical. We have to take seriously Arendt's claim that judgment, namely how do we judge the past, is not a logical procedure. It's neither deductive, namely we come up with a rule and then we apply that rule to particular cases, nor is it inductive, right? And this is, I think, a mistake some people make. We don't start with the cases and develop a rule. Judgment is not rule-bound. There are no rules for the application of rules. It's one of the most important lines of all of Kant's work. You cannot ever, because even if you come up with a rule saying you should never lie, whether you come up deductively or inductively, from top or from bottom, how do you apply that rule? Was this a lie? Was it not a lie? Was it a good lie, a bad lie? There's no rule for it. And so you can't ever make judgments according to rules. What Kant understood for Arendt is that judgment happens according to something like taste. I like it. It seems good to me. It is good to me. And so what Kant says is, when I see a painting or I hear a bird call, I don't say it feels good to me or it sounds good to me or it looks good to me. I say it is beautiful. It is good. And how do I say that? What rule allows me to say that this painting by Van Gogh is beautiful, but this other one is not? And Kant says there is no rule. It speaks in the voice of God or reason. It makes claims about beauty or goodness, but without any rule. And it has to be based on some authority above the human. Well, how do you do that? That's the problem that Arendt is latching onto here with the problem of judgment. And when she says is, first of all, there's no rule for it, therefore it can't be taught. You can't teach someone to be a good judge. Either somebody knows what a beautiful painting is or they don't. And that's not a very satisfying claim. But let me now back it up a little bit. You can't teach somebody how to be a good judge of a painting or an act or morality, but we all can practice it. And how do you practice it? Well, you make judgments. And you talk to other people, and you look to other people, and you watch their judgments. Arendt says that Kant's great insight here was that we don't judge according to logic, but according to regulative ideals. Regulative ideals are, again, a fancy word, but there are three in Kant. There's God, freedom, and immortality. And the one that I think is easiest for me to explain and the one that's most appropriate here and relevant is freedom. At the end of the second critique, Kant's second critique, he writes, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener and more steadily we reflect on them. So this is reflective judgment. The more we reflect on these two things, the more our minds are filled with ever-increasing admiration and awe. One of those things is the starry heavens above, and the other is the moral law within. So what does that mean? It means for Kant that when we reflect on the moral law, not by rules, how do we reflect on it? In his book, The Second Critique, and in also the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, he says that the main way we reflect on morals, on the moral law, is through examples. We see somebody jump onto the train tracks to rescue someone else who's fallen over there, and we know that that was a freely done, not required by any law, freely done act that was moral. And we're struck by such an act, by the examples. And we think it must be a moral law to help people in need. And so when we see an example of someone act morally, someone step in front of someone else to take a bullet, or someone, when they don't agree with a war, go to war anyway because it's their moral duty to do so. Someone when they know that lying would be in their best interest but tells the truth. When we see examples of such moral acts, we, just like when we see a Van Gogh painting, we say it's beautiful, we say that's moral. We say that's an example of doing your duty. And we're so struck by it, Arendt says, that we're filled with awe. Now, this word awe, is a word that many of us don't really understand anymore. But awe means something. And if you're in awe of something, what do you do when you're in awe of something? You bow down before it. And so what Arendt says is, when we actually reflect on examples of moral action, we are so filled with awe that we bow down before them, and we do what? We tell ourselves that we have to act that way as well. That's the only way someone can be brought to act. Now, that doesn't mean you will act morally, because I may say I'm going to always tell the truth because I've seen how beautiful that is and how amazing that is, and yet faced with having to tell the truth in an uncomfortable situation, I may still lie. But when I do it, I will know I have broken my moral obligation. And that's what Kant says. That's how the regulative ideals work. And so judgment requires reflecting on the examples of beauty, taste, morality, and practicing making those judgments ourselves, for which there are no rules. And so just to finish up, what she says is there are really then only two alternatives in the modern world for how we make judgments. We can judge with Hegel and Marx and almost all modern moral philosophers who tell us that we should judge according to what is right, according to a standard of either success or a kind of standard of moral education, which is supposed to tell us what is right. And that's what she thinks is the wrong standard of judgment. Or we can judge according to Kantian autonomy, that I set myself under the law and I have to make the judgment myself without any rules, without any standards, without any bearings. And that's what she calls legenteonta, quoting from Herodotus, which is that I must say what is. Brings us back to this relative idea that we talked about in thinking as well. And thus she ends the book with this line that she quotes from Cato: the victorious cause pleased the god. Namely, whatever wins, capitalism wins over socialism, if that's the case, or liberal democracy wins over authoritarian government, if that's the case. Whatever wins, the victorious cause, is the cause that pleased the god, or pleased reason, if you're Hegelian. And thus it's right. But the second part of the quote is, but the defeated cause pleases Cato. And that's where Arendt stands, that we don't judge according to success or reason or divine inspiration. We judge in the end what pleases us. And judgment for her is thus, like thinking, always going to be some sort of a relative claim of my judgment that I know, but it's a claim of not that I think it, but that it's true. But it's one that doesn't have any criteria for it. So that's where she ends the postscript. She then writes the section on willing, and we never do get the section on judging. We have lots of short things that she writes on judgment over the years that can be helpful in our attempt to understand it. And we'll talk about some of that, I'm sure, now as we go forward. But let me stop there and let you guys make some comments or ask questions or tell me if this makes you interested in the question of judgment, how we want to think about it. I'll stop there.
I'll just jump in and add a couple of notes about the intellectual history of the life of the mind. So Arendt wrote what are essentially three drafts of this first section on thinking. And then there was an edited draft put together by Mary McCarthy and Jerome Cohn. And so it's the most complete part of the life of the mind that we have. She finished all of Willing as well, in one draft form, except for two sections that were included in the editing. And then the judging section, which wasn't finished, which was published by Viner, comes from lectures she gave in the mid-70s before she died. But the Postscriptum that we just talked about was heavily edited by Mary McCarthy when it was published in The Life of the Mind. And it was actually 10 pages and not 4. And the 6 pages that were cut out of it have to do with judging, and expand some of her reflections on judging moving forward in the text. I think Roger hit on all the key points that are included in the expanded version of the Postscriptum. So I won't go back over that.
I used the expanded version to
could tell, but
elaborate the shortened version.
Yeah, you did. And so if you want to read the longer version, it's included in Thinking Without a Banister, the new volume that was edited by Jerome Cohn, and it's titled Transitions. And it's titled Transitions because when Arendt was giving lectures, I believe this is right, when Arendt was giving lectures on the life of the mind from 1969 until her death, in these various sections, she would prepare 4 to 5 page lecture notes, which she would title Transitions. And so that's how it got that title in Thinking Without a Banister. McCarthy labeled this Postscriptum. And there's other historical notes, but those are some of the key things. Roger, your mic's not on.
There are reasons that her interest in judgment is so. I sometimes you know me, I like to be provocative. So fetishized by Arendt scholars. There's a hope that if we understand what she says by judgment, we will be able to make judgments. We will be able to decide the important political questions of our time. But I think if you understand what she actually wanted to say in the section on judgment, that's largely a pipe dream. She was not going to give us answers to how we make judgments. She was going to say something along the lines of that judgments require practice, require thinking, and are always to some degree my judgments about what is true, what is moral, what is right, and they're going to have a similar need for being accepted by spectators as do the things of thought, whether those things be artworks or political acts. One of the places in her work where she most, I think, most clearly expresses her thoughts about judgment is the last 3 or 4 pages of her essay, The Crisis of Culture, in Between Past and Future. And in that essay, at the very end, she offers another quote, I think from Cicero, if I remember it correctly, which is that I prefer before heaven to go astray with Plato rather than hold true views with his opponents. And this, I think, very much fits with the quote from Cato that she talks about here: the victorious cause please the gods, the defeated one pleases Cato. What I think she means by it, as she explains it, is that as a humanist, as somebody who loves the world, and someone who cares about the world that we humans live in, it's more important to go astray with your friends, like Plato, to follow the ideas that are meaningful and make your word meaningful than it is to go astray, then hold true views with his opponents. Once again, this is a theme in Arendt's work that we've come across in so many different areas. Truth is not the guide star of her work. Meaning in this case is, or friendship is, and respect. If meaning is the lodestar of thinking, what is the lodestar of judgment? That's a good question. But it's to say what is. It's to judge the past in a way that you say what it is, you give your account of it, and you do so under the awe-inspiring commandment to judge according to moral and ethical dictates. We could ask, what's the connection between thinking and judging, which is a question that people ask a lot in reading Arendt and also outside of reading Arendt. And I'm not sure I have a full answer to that. I mean, she says thinking is not the prerequisite for judging or willing. Now, she tells you why it's not the prerequisite for judging, right? I mean, for willing. She says thinking is not the prerequisite for willing because willing is free. And therefore, it can't be set under reason. So why is thinking not the prerequisite for judgment? Well, because judgment also is free. Judgment is autonomous. And it is a kind of it is a saying of what is about the past. Whereas thinking, if I've understood her on thinking, is a saying of what is and what's meaningful about the present. So that thinking and judging are, in many ways, at least as I understand her accounts of them, parallel or analogous in the way they operate. Although thinking is not a regulative ideal, it's simply a wrestling of the present without even a regulative ideal. Whereas judging adds this regulative ideal to the battle that thinking is in the present. But I as with anyone else trying to grapple with Arendt's thinking on judging, I'm struggling with the fact that she never fully articulates it, and so this is just speculation here. But I'm happy to speculate and hear your speculations and see what we come up with.
Roger, if it's okay to go backwards a little in the volume, something emerges for me actually in all of Arendt's work, which is this concept that she keeps repeating, having originated with the Greeks, that is, that we become immortal, people can become immortal, or people, or immortality itself is a reflection of things that are remembered and honored, and that's how you achieve immortality. Other people speak of you in the world. Your work is remembered and it is honored. So, and she speaks from a history, from a world history that changed almost immediately after she died, in which the actions and speeches of people were recorded at a level that had never previously occurred. So that when you look at the world of today, things that people are saying and doing are so numerous and so various and all preserved forever, right? They can be relocated and honored almost at any time. I wonder if that changes at all that way of thinking about how immortality is achieved.
Well, it has to. I mean, so I think she already thought in the 1950s that that we had lost this concern with immortality. I mean, I could turn it around and say that one of the reasons it's okay and that we create technologies that make immortality ever more difficult is because we no longer are actually worried about immortality. Um, you know, largely because I've been schooled by people like Heidegger and Arendt on these questions. Whenever someone says technology is changing the world this way, what Arendt and Heidegger always do is say technology can emerge because we've already begin to think differently, and we create the technology we want and we need. For Arendt, politics, she says, in the human condition demands a transcendence into an earthly immortality. That's one of the great statements about politics that very few people in her work pay attention to. You can't do politics without an earthly immortality. Not a universal immortality, not a religious immortality, but an earthly immortality. As we know, she thinks humans are earthly beings and also worldly beings. What does it mean to be earthly? Well, to some degree, it means that we are born onto this earth, and certain things are given to us. We're born into a world, and that world pre-exists us, and will live on after we die. And that immortality, that idea that we live in a world that we're born into and that will outlast us, is something at the very core of what politics is. It's about the creation, affirmation, maintenance, preservation, conservation, and change of that world that precedes and outlasts us. And that is the world that she thought the Greeks had, that eudaimonia, the Greek word which we call happiness or blessedness, is not just a passing mood. She cites this ancient saying that nobody can be called happy or eudaimon before he is dead. And she adds that eudaimonia, like life itself, is a lasting state of being which is neither subject to change nor capable of affecting change. So to have eudaimonia for Arendt is to, in a sense, be part of an immortal world. She thinks this immortal world is largely over, or something we no longer are concerned with. And that's partly because that to live in an immortal world, you have to have standards, like you have to believe in things like greatness. You have to believe in things that deserve to last. And we increasingly don't believe in such things. And so we level everything down into a kind of presentism with a progress governed by success. And there's very little room for judgment. And this is why judgment is such an important political idea for Arendt, because without making free, autonomous judgments about what is beautiful and what is good, we can't claim that certain worlds, certain polities, certain things deserve to last more so than others. And this gets us into cultural politics, Jack, as you know. I mean, which political worlds are more valuable than others? Which artworks are more beautiful than others? Which books should be read by young people more than others? These are judgments. And for Arendt, she will never tell you what the answer to those judgments is. It's not like she thinks we know that Plato is more valuable than, take your pick, but a book by Berkowitz. But we have to make those judgments. And if we don't, we lose that lastingness and meaningfulness of a world that actually matters. And that's the danger, the political danger of the loss of judgment. I'm not sure if I've completely answered your question, but maybe you can follow on from that. I tried to say something about it.
Well, I like your answer, Roger, but it brings another question into mind, which is really a subset of what I was trying to say. So media had preserved, for example, the creation of art in a way that prior to the kind of preservation that current media allow, prior to that, there were fashions, art changed, ideas changed, so on and so forth. Even the idea of progress was progressive in a way, because there was an ongoing movement in tradition. But tradition tradition in the sense in which it was meant in the 19th and early part of the 20th century is gone. Tradition is now like everything that ever happened, right? And if I think about young people today, just yesterday we showed a film that was made in 1988, and I thought, for these young people, it's a classic, right? There's there is this huge panoply of material out there, and there's devotion to parts of the past. We find people deciding that they want to live in 1920s Paris. They dress accordingly. They only have something to do with the art of that period, and they build their whole lives around that. And if you want to exercise some taste, for example, taste in the Kantian sense, there is so much to have to listen to or to look at to make sense of what it is that you like.
I think that's right. And in fact, if you try and say, well, it's not just that I don't like it, but it's ugly, you risk quite a rebellion, especially if you're in a college campus today. Should we as teachers, and one of the things that Arendt says teachers do is that we lead students into the world, lead young people into the world, and we tell them what is. It's the same, this quote of Herodotus that I mentioned here and is in this last postscript is one that she uses in so many of her works in the 1950s and 60s. Legein te onta, to say what is. And part of what she understands teaching to do is to teach people not whether the world is good or bad, but what it is, so that they can judge it. But to say what it is means you have to say what, you have to say that the world has said this is beautiful and this is ugly, this is good and this is bad. That's something that very few people are willing to do today. And without it, you get the kind of fragmentation of taste and fragmentation of politics. And you not only get this fragmentation, but you get people living in what we might call thinner worlds, worlds in which if I live, in my group of people who like this, and you live in your group of people like that, and we say, let others be. We don't make a claim that what we're really doing is right. We just say it's different, it's diverse, and so we value diversity at all costs. But what's the cost of that? I mean, the opposite of one of the things we don't very often ask is what's the opposite of diversity? What's the value lost when we elevate diversity to the highest value? And I guess the answer would be something like community. Uh, Although I'm happy to hear thoughts on that.
Just
But
one thing that's lost is the canon.
Yeah,
well, the canon, you can, I mean, you'll have multiple canons, but what you don't have is community. You
Also,
don't
we,
have
I
what?
disagree, Roger.
I
I
think,
disagree.
Okay.
I think that divergence or recognizing plurality and recognizing that different cultures and different groups see the world differently builds community. What is important is the bridging capital, social capital, where communities can be comprised of people who share similar values, similar experiences, and things like that, but recognize diversity and where they can deal with someone who has a different perspective, and each can be respectful of the other. I think that's the way
Okay.
our world has to
Howard,
be today.
Howard,
I agree
Howard, there's
with
a
Jack.
difference. Let me just say there's maybe a misunderstanding. There's a difference between what Arendt calls plurality and what I was using the word diversity to mean. Um, so plurality says that everybody is unique and there is no truth in politics, and that we confront each other both as equals and as uniquely different. Um, Diversity, I think, is something very different from plurality, at least as I understand both terms. Diversity is a claim that what is true is that uh, there are infinite diversities that need to be recognized, and that there is no standard for in any way making judgments about and amongst those different diverse claims. And what diversity does is it continues to break up any particular unity into ever more diversity. So if you have, just to use an example, you have chess players, and then you have chess players who like to play white, and other chess players like to play black, and you have then who like to use this opening or that opening. You have, let's just use a more loaded example. You have Jews, but then you have Orthodox Jews, you have conservative Jews, you have Reform Jews, you have atheist Jews. There's no end. Then you have male Jews, and then you have white Jews, black Jews. I mean, there's just no end to the claim of diversity. And in fact, the more different kinds of Jews you have, the better, according to the logic of diversity. And so there's no claim in a world in which diversity is your value that, in addition to uniqueness, which plurality gives you, there's also the claim of equality as a good, and as a claim that equality has to be met in a certain level, and thus a kind of political solidarity emerges around ideas that we all share. I think that's the Arendtian idea that includes a solidarity amongst a plurality. I think that's a harder idea to defend when you embrace diversity as it's currently understood today. So the claim that the opposite of diversity is community is, I think, a claim that I think Arendtian plurality is completely compatible with community. But I don't know how diversity is. But maybe someone can tell me.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, Sam, why don't you
Go ahead.
So
tell me where I'm wrong?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that Arendt is drawing such a sharp distinction between diversity as we might understand it as conceptually and plurality as it's functioning in her work. I think diversity as a term and the way it's been crystallized in our political conversations today is very different than the kind of diversity and plurality that Hannah Arendt's talking about in The Human Condition. And I don't think that she would be readily accepting of the kind of identitarian diversity norms that drive our contemporary politics. But so the definition of plurality in The Human Condition is that men and not man inhabit the earth and make the world together. And she argues that we have to share this world together. And then, plurality is the, kind of fundamental driving concept of the human condition also means that each human being born into the world is unique. We all appear in the world different from one another. And this difference is a part of the human condition and part of the fundamental plurality of the human condition. And this is why she says Eichmann has to die at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? He violated this fundamental condition of plurality, of this diversity as it appears in the world, right? As a condition of plurality. Just because you appear in the world as a Jewish person, and so are singled out for that, and that's for Arendt, that is that's how she gets to that judgment of Eichmann at the end of the Eichmann book. So I think community is absolutely something that we get out of this. I think the other important thing is meaning, right? Meaning in the stories that we tell ourselves. One of the huge political problems that we're dealing with today as a result of identity politics is that people think that they don't have access to other people's experiences of the world, to their stories, right? That you have to stay in your lane, that we can't talk about experiences that aren't immediately our own. On campus, one of the arguments we hear right now is that only Black professors should teach text by Black authors, or only queer professors should teach text by queer authors. And this is a foreclosure of the imagination in the Arendtian sense, right? It's a strike against that plurality that's necessary for becoming more empathetic human beings. And so I think, to the way that I ask the question in reading Arendt is, how can we embrace difference and diversity without judging it in a way that negates it or flattens it, so that we can build that community together and find meaning together and richness in our diversity of experiences in the world that expand our imaginations.
Yeah, I agree more with Sam. Any college campus that I've been on today, or any urban area, you can't deny the diversity. It hits you in the face, and that's fine. And the idea of the melting pot, where this diversity has to meld into a single community, is absurd in our present day world. So
no one's saying that, Howard. I don't know what you heard me say, but certainly that's not what I said.
Well, that's what I heard. But so I agree with Sam. The key today is to learn how to live with that diversity. And that's our challenge.
I think embrace it. I don't think, it's not something that we should suffer or just live with. It's something that we should, actively embrace, and not in any kind of, Bill Clinton, I feel your pain kind of way, but in a genuine way where we allow other people's experiences of the world to stand on their own and to expand our imagination of what the world can be. Katie, are you trying to jump in? I see you popped up here.
Yes, I was trying to jump in. I was, this exchange between the three of you, I was thinking about my experiences teaching gender studies, and going back to Roger's point that I don't think that people know how to judge anymore or feel like they can judge. Because I have students who I know have questions, you can see it, and they don't want to ask a question because they don't want to be wrong, or they don't want to be pointed out as that person. And so I think to get to the point where, Howard's talking about, we've lost practice. We don't have opportunities to practice judgment anymore. So I guess it's not a question, that's more of a comment, but it's something that I see as a real problem in addition to what you were saying.
So Roger, do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to?
I was hoping some people would join in, but maybe, I don't know if people have things to say. So
Roger, could I get back to immortality?
Yeah, but maybe let Sam jump in first. She had something to say.
Sure, absolutely.
Katie?
Yep.
I just, Katie, I agree with you and with Roger that, it's not only that we have lost to a degree and are losing our capacity to be critical thinkers, to make judgments in the world today, but that, we live in a culture where judgment is, it's not even on the table in a way, because we don't have real critique anymore. What we have is criticism, endless criticism, and a kind of, casting of moral value judgments. And these kinds of moral value judgments that we make about one another in political conversation are not the kinds of judgments that Hannah Arendt is talking about. She's pointing us toward a form of judgment that she in the lectures on judgment, she talks about as lowercase c, lowercase t critical thinking, right? And a form of judgment that's very much related to this kind of self-reflective thinking that she's been talking about in this book. And it has certain requirements for her, certain requirements that we go wandering, right? To imagine the world from the perspective of another. And this is precisely what Eichmann couldn't do, because his thinking was logically shaped by ideology. And so there, I think I see a bridge between thinking and judging, to go back to, I think, part of where Roger ended his opening remarks, and how she's connecting the two together. Which is not to say that they're the same thing, but they are related to one another for Arendt, and related on the grounds of imagination and how we expand our capacity for thinking to become more capable of judging, which is world building. It's world building.
Let me add to that, and I'm trying to still understand why Howard has, in my mind, so fundamentally misunderstood what I was trying to say, and I think maybe it's this: I'm not talking about diversity as a fact, right? Arendt calls plurality a fact of human existence. If we speak of diversity as a fact, then it's plurality, and I fundamentally agree. And yeah, I mean, the point is to to understand that there are different people and welcome that because that's what humans are, and figure out how to live together. To the extent I'm separating plurality and diversity, I'm saying that diversity has ceased to be a fact in our language and the way we talk about it, and it's become an ideal that needs to be unceasingly, progressively pursued. And when that's the case, every single group that emerges needs to then be broken up into 15 other groups. There can be no claim of a kind of reflective judgment, a kind of claim of this is right, this is wrong. And in fact, any claim of community, as in the work of someone like Jacques Rancière, is immediately seen as suspect and violent and evil. And so there's no claim in what I'm making that denies the fact or the goodness of difference, plurality, many different views, etc. The question is, at some point, do you aspire to find judgments that can speak for a community or not? And to me, that's where Arendt stands against someone like Jacques Rancière. Because in the end, she wants to make judgments about who we are. And Rancière says that any judgments about who we are policing judgments that therefore exclude other people and therefore are wrong. That's a fundamental distinction that matters, and I think it's to some degree based on a misunderstanding of diversity versus plurality. Diversity as an never-ending ideal versus plurality as a fact. So I don't know if that helps. I'm just trying to understand why it was more controversial or different than I expected. But Patrick, I know you had you wanted to jump in about immortality. Why don't we go that direction?
I don't know. It might be too off this subject. I just had I thought reading her for not just this bit, but I thought she overrated immortality in writing, in the sense that I don't know. Immortality seems to me very unpredictable, not a thing you can point a finger at. And using a trivial example, it's whenever you see a baseball game, if anybody watches baseball, and the reporters are asking the player about the next game and the next series in the World Series, and the player says, "I'm just worrying about right now, this game, this pitch, this moment." And then maybe that game becomes one of the greatest baseball games of all time. But the point is that participants are just looking at the moment and not thinking about immortality at all. And get back to something Jack mentioned about a movie. I mean, Chaplin's movies, what was that, The Modern Thing and The Dictator, became immortal, really classic movies, but not, he just made them as entertainment, I presume.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. I mean, and these are, I think I mentioned this last week. I just have been writing a lot about immortality in Arendt, so I've been emphasizing it. I think that's okay because it's usually de-emphasized. The importance of immortality in Arendt is that without it, we lose our sense of purpose and meaning in the world. So I see this thought actually begin, I don't know if it's the first place, but I begin this thought in chapter 9 of The Origins of Totalitarianism in Arendt's work, where she says that the only human right is to act and speak in public in ways that matter. And what she says is that to be human is not to be alive, because you can die in ways that matter and be very human in doing it. To be human is to matter and to be remembered and to have a life that is, even if it's not remembered, is worthy of being remembered. And that's her claim in the Origins, in her chapter on human rights. In On Revolution, she again says that what matters more for humans is not whether they're rich or poor, but that they can act and be seen and be visible and be heard in a public world. And that's what makes it bearable to live a human life. And so for the Greeks and for others, immortality matters, not because it's immortal, because it's not, but because it makes a claim that you're part of a meaningful project. You're part of a meaningful world. And that even if your life is somewhat insignificant, and if it's painful, and if it's tired and hungry, and whatever it is, you're part of something that will last. And it makes your life meaningful, makes you meaningful. And when we lose religion, and we lose tradition, and we lose public judgments about what's great and deserving to be remembered and not, we end up being abandoned by that claim of meaning. We've talked a lot about loneliness in this group because it's something that both Samantha and I care a lot about. But the opposite of immortality may not be mortality so much as the rise of loneliness in the world. And so that's why the question of immortality is such an important question for Arendt. I don't know if that's so awful that no one wants to say anything, but we can maybe go to the chats. Johanna writes, awe is often associated with Joyce's definition of art, that art affects us, brings about aesthetic arrest. If we apply this to judgment and morality, how do we know we are right in what we judge as moral? I mean by this, there have been acts performed by persons that seem awesome, moral, like Napoleon, who's still honored by some French people and is bringing a system of law. And yet the regime was brutal. Okay, that's a great question. I mean, and it's an eternal question, you know. If you take the Arendtian view that greatness has no criteria, except that it's to some degree recognized as great, how do you separate Hitler from Churchill? Well, one answer is the Hegelian Marxian answer, which is success or moral education, and Arendt doesn't agree with that. So in the end, it comes down to taste, making a judgment. And you may say, well, that's terrible because some people may like Hitler more than Churchill, or pick your group. And I think that's true. And in the end, Arendt says we have to be willing to make those judgments and seek to persuade others that we're right. We have to persuade others that the judgment that Hitler is great is not just, relatively worse, but a bad judgment. And the judgment that, I don't know who your heroes are, Martin Luther King or Churchill are great, is a good judgment. And we have to be willing to make that claim and hope that we can somehow persuade other people, not by rational arguments, because these are not rational judgments. They are judgments of taste. But taste in the sense of claims of rightness, not just my taste. So, yeah, it's a good question. Anyone want to rephrase it?
Roger,
Yeah.
Roger, sorry, I cut myself off there for a second. I was just going to ask, when you said what you said before I cut myself off, recall that she said about Bluebeard, you walk away. What do you think of that? When you say
Yeah.
persuade, you also said you walk away. There's nothing to say to these people.
There's nothing to say to those people, exactly, because you're not going to convince them. But you're going to hope that you're going to make judgments of Bluebeard and you're going to walk away, and you're going to hope that other people agree with you. You can't tell them that they have to. You can't tell them that logic tells them they have to, or that there's some rule or law that tells them they have to. But you're going to hope that they're going to see it your way and not Bluebeard's way. I mean, what's the alternative? That there's some rule or some standard?
Well, I think the other possibility. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. The other possibility is that when you put forth your judgment and you're engaged in a conversation where you're not only speaking, but you're listening, and the other person is too, that when you walk away from that conversation, there may be a modification of both perspectives, which is less than I'm right and you're wrong, or you should be my way or I should be your way.
Yeah. You would hope so, right? I mean, and you would hope that the modification would be in the direction that you know is right. And to some degree, what that means is we need people practiced at making judgments who can be persuasive, not in their reason, but in their judgments. So let me give an example that I wrote about in Amor Mundi last week. At the end of the book on Eichmann, Arendt says that the Israeli judges, because they were trying to be so careful and legalistic and fair to Eichmann, made a mistake in her mind. Namely, they judged Eichmann guilty according to the law. And the only law they could find that he broke was the law against aiding and abetting killing. And she said, legally this may have been right, but as an act of judgment, it was an abomination, she thought. She says to claim that what Eichmann's crime was aiding and abetting murder was just fully misunderstand what Eichmann had done. And she says sometimes you have to understand that a judgment requires you to say, look, the law doesn't apply here, and I'm going to make a judgment outside the law, a political judgment. And then she gives her judgment, and she says, we find that you didn't want Jews to exist, and that is an abomination, and so we don't think you should exist. Is that in the law anywhere? No. She made it up. But what she says is that's a judgment. And I think, this is my reading of it, is she says, what I want in making this judgment, I want other people to hear it and say, I agree. And accept that Eichmann should be killed, and that we make this judgment that people like Eichmann don't deserve to live. That's an extraordinary claim. And I was comparing it to the question of impeachment. Because over and again, what you're going to hear over the next 3 or 4 months about impeachment is, did President Trump break a law? What law did he break? And the answer is, if he broke a law, it's going to be some small, irrelevant legal code somewhere, right? You know, and I'm not saying it's not important that he broke a law or not. It is, but if he should be impeached, it's for high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's interestingly enough that when they were debating that language in the Federal Convention, the example that they turned to was the example of Warren Hastings, who was the viceroy of the English Empire in India, who used incredibly brutal methods to control India. And the person who brought the impeachment trial against Hastings was Edmund Burke, the conservative thinker. And he brought a 6-year impeachment trial against Hastings, and eventually Hastings was not impeached. And one of the reasons he wasn't impeached is because he didn't really break the rules. The rules allowed him to do what he did. And what part of Burke's argument was that an impeachment trial is not about the law, it's about politics. It's about us saying and arguing about what is and is not right. And I think Arendt really got that there are times when politics requires you to make judgments outside the rules. And when you do so, you're in a sense making an act, you're in a sense creating an artwork, you're creating an act, and you're saying, here's my judgment. And you're asking people to say, I agree with you, or I disagree with you. And there's no, I mean, you can make arguments, but there's no right argument or wrong argument. In the end, it's a matter of taste. And one of the reasons we appeal to the law, one of the reasons the Israeli court did it, it's one of the reasons we're going to do it in our trial in the impeachment trial, is because we're increasingly afraid of making judgments. We are a people who doesn't believe that any of us has the right to make judgments. We only have the right to enforce the rules. We want certainty. I mean, this is one of the fundamental dictates of liberalism, right? That we need certainty and we need rules, and nobody has the right to make a kind of extraordinary judgment. And one of the ways in which Arendt and Burke in this case are illiberal is their belief in the need for judgments that are not certain and rule-bound at certain times. And I think...
Roger?
Yeah, go ahead. Daphne.
De Tocqueville also said that because Americans tend to be so shocked by the notion that someone's opinion is better than the other, he wrote, that's why in America you'd prefer to elect dolts, to people who are actually thinkers and good managers, because God forbid that would mean that their opinion is better than the rest.
I think that's right. It's part of our fear of making judgments and fear of people making judgments. Is that, if I understood you correctly?
And Roger, just
not me, it was de Tocqueville. So
okay.
I'm quoting de Tocqueville. I don't say things that are clever.
I doubt that.
And Roger, I just want to add to what you said, if I may, that the court in Nuremberg prevailed by creating the law. There was no law. They said that these are crimes against humanity. Nobody had ever stated those laws. That was the basis on which they convicted, because they said it's not a question of existing law. It's a question. The court stated a moral question, but it was exactly the way you just framed Arendt's comments about Eichmann. That is, they didn't convict on some tiny infraction. They convicted on a law that didn't exist.
Interestingly enough, Jack, I mean, she discusses this again near the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem. There were differences of opinion in the Nuremberg court, and they actually made the judgment on a couple of different grounds. One was grounds of laws of war, and one was crimes against humanities. And similarly, she said that the attempt to ground this on the laws of war didn't work. And it was only so insofar as they added the crimes against humanity that the judgment at Nuremberg was true to the just it was a little more complicated. But yes, you're right to say that. We're there's a couple more questions. We're running out of time. I'm sorry. There's a lot of questions here that I don't have time to look at. Is there any particular question that has been written down that I didn't get to that someone wants answered? Because we have time maybe for one more question. Okay. Let me then just spend the last couple minutes. We have to decide what to read next. We talked about it last time. I think that we have time for 4 sessions left this semester, and I think that that's perfectly timed to allow us to read the book Crises of the Republic, in which there's 4 essays. So we're going to read Lying in Politics for November 8th will be the first one. We're not going to provide PDFs anymore for books like that are readily available and cheap. We have a legal issue. If it's a book that's hard to get, like some of the ones we've read recently, will help out if you can't get it. But I encourage you to buy the book Crises of the Republic. You can get very cheap paperback editions of it. There's also a link on our website where you can get a 20% off if you order it from Oblong Books in Rhinebeck. And you can order it from them. But it's the Hannah Arendt book, Crises of the Republic. It's got 4 essays in it, 3 essays and an interview. The essays are Lying in Politics, Civil Disobedience, and on Violence, and then Thoughts on Revolution is the interview. We've read some of these before as a group, individually, but never, I think, throughout as a book. So this will be an attempt to do that, and our first session will be November 8th. I want to just say 1 or 2 other things. I think this is a great group, and we've really developed a good working relationship. To the extent you know people who might benefit from it, since you all do and like it, I really do encourage you to reach out and ask some of your friends to join us. I think it would be really good if we could bring in a couple of new regulars to our reading group. So, if you have any ideas of people or groups that we might appeal to, if you have students that might want to join the reading group, we can make an exception and let students in for a very low price or free. But I think it would be good to expand our reaches. Lastly, I want to say that for those of you who are in the New York, New Jersey area, tonight I'll be speaking after the performance of my wife's new play, which is about Hannah Arendt, called Mrs. Stern Wanders the Prussian State Library. We posted a review of it in Amor Mundi that came out on Wednesday. So if you're in New Jersey or New York and you want to come see me talk about Arendt after the play, I'll be doing that tonight in New Jersey. It runs for 3 more weeks, and it's really a wonderful play about Hannah Arendt. It's set in the 8-day period in which she's being interrogated by the Gestapo in 1933 when she was arrested. So the whole play takes place in the interrogation cell, and it's incredibly relevant today as we think about interrogations and arrests and refugees and other groups of people. So if you're around, I'd love to see you. Sam, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's great. I'm going to go try and see the play soon too. So if I think the virtual reading group is a great opportunity for if you do have students, for them to join as well. I know we have a couple grad students in our group who pop in and out who are working on Arendt, but if you have people who you think might be interested, please let them know. And I pulled up the schedule in case you wanted it really quick. We're going to do November 8th, Lying in Politics, November 15th will be civil disobedience, and then the 22nd on violence. And then our last session this semester will be December 6th on thoughts and politics and revolution.
Yeah. So just to say, we're going to go 3 weeks in a row to
Yeah.
get the book in. Does anyone object to that? If we go 3 weeks in a row in November? Then there's Thanksgiving. We take 2 weeks off, and then we finish up in December, and then we'll take the break for the holiday. And we can talk about what we want to read next. I was actually thinking maybe Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we've never read in this group, but we can talk about what you guys want to read. I know some of you would like to have a longer conversation about the conference that we had a couple weeks ago. And some of the questions that emerged. And we're going to send out an email to the group asking anyone who'd like to, and we'll set up a special Blue Jeans session for that. So thank you guys for those of you who are helping to organize that. Otherwise, I'm really excited to read Crisis of the Republic. It's one of my favorite books of Hannah Arendt's. So I hope you'll enjoy it, and maybe reach out to some of your friends and ask them to join and see if they like it as well. All right?
Roger, I have a question before you sign off.
Yeah.
So there was an entire conference devoted to civil disobedience, and I'm wondering if there are any parts of that conference that you feel are significantly relevant to her piece on it that we might want to take a look at. Because to look at the whole conference is ridiculous, but there might be something that you could suggest either now or in an email somehow or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that. I mean, obviously I gave the opening talk at the conference, which was on her essay, Civil Disobedience. David Bromwich, I think, gave a talk that would be relevant on it. Trying to think if anyone else precisely talked. Sam, do you remember if anyone else precisely talked about her talk?
Talked about which talk specifically?
Or talked about civil disobedience.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up. I mean, so David Bromwich's talk is, I think, relevant to the conversation we were having today because he talks about the possibility of aesthetic judgment in the Kantian sense that Arendt's discussing it. I'm looking at our schedule.
I can't remember her name, but there was the woman, the philosophy professor who commented on Hannah Arendt and desegregation. I thought that was an interesting thing to discuss. The Little Rock, obviously.
Do you mean
that was this conference? We're talking about the conference 2 years ago on civil disobedience, or a year and a half ago.
So the last panel I would take a look at with Kenyon Adams and Thomas Chatterton Williams and Amy Schiller. They touch a little bit on Arendt's essay on civil disobedience and the idea of civil disobedience. But I think those were the only, I would say those are the two most relevant ones that actually touch on Arendt. The other would be Theda Skocpol's keynote about the Tea Party and the anti-Trump resistance movement in the United States, which would also be good.
So you can watch those, or if you have the journal, my introduction, Theda Skocpol's article, and that last panel are all printed, if I'm not mistaken, in the new issue of the journal. So you can read them there. And that might be a way to look at it. Okay? Thank you, guys, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. We'll see you on November 8th in 2 weeks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Roger.
Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks.
Enjoy the play, Raj.